The last mention, at least not where Rodney had access, was that half the shuttles were barely patched together and the command was pushing underqualified teams to meet impossible quotas. That was probably how he got assigned here in the first place. He wasn't recon, he wasn't a soldier, he was a systems technician who specialized in improvisation under duress, and even that barely described what he did. He fixed the things that broke in ways they weren't supposed to break. But here he was, seated beside a stone-faced beast woman scout who hadn't spoken more than 5 words since boarding and regarded him like a tick on her flank. Abigail didn't hide her disdain. Her arms were crossed over her chest, lean and corded with muscle, her fur rippling slightly with every vibration of the shuttle. Stripes ran along her limbs like war paint, and her glowing yellow eyes never blinked, not even when turbulence slammed the hull. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ask his name, only muttered one thing when she saw his face: "You'll slow me down." He tried to brush it off. She didn't know him, and he didn't expect a warm welcome. But as the shuttle hit atmosphere and the chaotic terrain of the broken moon came into view, a mad sprawl of wreckage, floating debris, and glowing magnetic fault lines, Rodney realized this wasn't going to be a mission. It was going to be survival. The drop went sideways fast. The autopilot AI began flickering when the atmospheric field around the moon warped their sensors. Abigail leapt to the controls and barked instructions at the machine, which didn't respond fast enough. Rodney didn't panic, but he could see in real time which parts of the shuttle systems were failing. Oxygen cycling stalled, the stabilizer gyro jammed, and the left side thruster began to pulse erratically. He unbuckled against orders, braced his legs against the panel, and started rerouting power with a handheld bypass tool. Abigail snarled at him to sit down, but he ignored her. When they hit the surface, it wasn't a clean landing. The ship skipped across jagged steel and half-melted satellite cores, tumbling nose-first into a ravine. Rodney's head cracked against the harness frame, and the next thing he knew, Abigail was dragging him through a hole torn in the fuselage, muttering curses in her native tongue. They weren't dead, yet. The air outside tasted like metal and smoke. Gravity shifted in irregular pulses, making it feel like walking across a mattress on one step, then an iron plate on the next. The landscape sprawled with ruins, old war debris, fractured ships, abandoned relay towers sparking quietly in the gloom. The sun was a dying thing behind the gas clouds, throwing orange flickers against the shattered rocks. Rodney clutched his side and staggered, but Abigail didn't wait. She moved with instinctive grace, weaving between wrecks, her striped tail swaying for balance. He caught up slower than he liked, and when she finally stopped, it was only to slam a sharp glance over her shoulder. "You'll get us both killed moving like that," she said, voice guttural but clear. "Stay behind. Speak only if necessary." Rodney gritted his teeth. "Fine, just don't leave me stranded." She didn't answer, already climbing a jagged slope. For hours, or maybe just what felt like hours, they moved through terrain that seemed designed to kill. Electrical pulses surged from damaged cores. Magnetized debris floated upward only to crash back down without warning, and the entire moon seemed to groan beneath their feet. Twice they encountered rogue drones, half-blind things with rusted limbs and scorched paint that screeched as they scanned for movement. Abigail neutralized the first with a low lunge and a blade to the optic core. Rodney handled the second by scrambling to erect panel and triggering an M-burst from a still-functioning comm relay, frying the drone sensors. Abigail glanced at him afterward, blinking once, not praise, more like reassessment. They took shelter in a broken maintenance pod nestled beneath a collapsed satellite dish. Rodney sank into the corner, trying not to feel the bruises forming beneath his jacket. Abigail crouched near the hatch, watching the outside. The silence stretched until he finally muttered, "You know, I was told this was going to be a basic scan mission, maybe tag a few cores, Mark Rex." No mention of death traps or killer drones. Abigail didn't turn her head. Command lies. They always lie. Rodney couldn't help but laugh once, bitter and sharp. "Yeah, I figured that out around the time our landing gear tore off mid-air." He expected her to scoff, maybe go silent again. Instead, she shifted slightly and said, "What did they tell you your role was?" "Tech recovery and system ID," he replied. "Anything still blinking gets cataloged. I make sure no booby traps get triggered, that sort of thing." "HMPH. You have no weapon, no armor, no backup," she said, tail twitching. "You're bait." Rodney blinked. "That's a little blunt." "Truth is always blunt. Doesn't mean it's wrong." There was no argument to make. He knew it too deep down. Still, something inside him refused to accept being written off as useless. He'd survived worse, escaped worse. He wasn't just soft meat to be tossed into the grinder. He could think, adapt, solve problems nobody else could. He leaned forward slightly. "You think I'm going to get you killed, but if you give me one chance, I can make myself useful." Abigail's glowing eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Then prove it." Just then the pod rumbled, faint at first, then sharper. Something outside had stirred. A whirring noise like bone on metal began circling the edge of the hatch. Abigail drew her blade in a smooth motion, every muscle taut. Rodney glanced around and spotted a flickering panel, its emergency pulse relay still functioning, barely. He darted forward, popped the casing open with his multi-tool, and began hot-wiring it. Abigail snarled at him not to move, but then the relay gave a pulse, just enough to confuse the incoming drone's navigation matrix. The hunter drone smashed into the far wall, spinning out of control and detonating in a harmless burst of static. Abigail's ears flattened in surprise. Rodney exhaled. "See, you bring the muscle, I bring the brains." She stared at him then, shockingly, bared her teeth in what wasn't quite a snarl. "Next time, soft one, warn me first." But she didn't look away from him for the rest of the night. The next morning, or what passed for morning on a moon fractured beyond repair, began with Abigail nudging Rodney awake using the back of her hand. Her claws grazed his chest as if testing how easily he bruised. "Time to move," she grunted, scanning the sky through the cracked hatch. The air smelled of ionized metal and static, and the rhythmic pulsing of magnetic storms rolled across the horizon like thunder made of light. Rodney sat up slower than he wanted to, ribs aching, throat dry, and nerves frayed. Still, he didn't complain. He noted her posture, alert, balanced on her toes, muscles always coiled, a born predator with a soldier's discipline. She wasn't waiting for him to catch up. She was already halfway to the exit before he finished fastening his jacket. They trekked across slanted plains, littered with artificial bones, crushed satellites, blackened mech husks, drone corpses half buried in ash. Abigail didn't speak unless necessary. She moved like she was born in gravity shifts and shrapnel fields. Rodney did his best to keep up, not asking for help, not lagging behind. When his foot slipped on a sloping steel plate and sent him stumbling into a low trench, he caught himself before hitting the jagged edge of a torn stabilizer blade. He winced, wiped dirt from his hands, and climbed out on his own. Abigail had stopped watching. She didn't offer help, but when he reached her side again, she simply kept walking. No mockery, that he suspected, was its own kind of approval. Their objective was a downed communications relay that still pinged intermittently on long-range scans. Rodney had detected it during their fallback the night before, and it might be their only shot at signaling command or figuring out why the transmission data they picked up was so corrupted. Abigail said little about it, but she didn't argue. That again felt like progress. They reached a ridge overlooking the signal source just as gravity began its irregular pulsing again, distorting the landscape with invisible force. Rodney felt his boots lift off the ground for a second before slamming back down. Abigail adjusted her stance fluidly, riding the wave like she'd done it 100 times. Below them, the relay tower jutted out from a collapsed mech frame, still sparking faintly with residual power. But it was surrounded. 3 drone scouts floated in erratic orbits around the wreckage, scanning for movement. These weren't like the rogue patrols from before. These were fresh, sleek, factory clean, which meant someone was deploying modern tech to guard a decades-old battlefield. Abigail growled low in her throat, crouching beside him as her eyes tracked their patrol pattern. Rodney crouched too, accessing his wrist module and patching into the tower's decay signal. Static bursts of encryption, but then beneath the noise he heard it. Not data logs, not distress pings, command signatures, spoofed ones. "Someone's faking our command signals," he whispered. "That relay been repurposed. It's not a distress beacon, it's bait." Abigail didn't respond right away. Her ears flicked once, then twice. "Someone's cleaning up loose ends," she said finally, "which makes us one of those ends." Rodney looked at the drones. "I might be able to jam their uplink. If I can get within range of that broken mech, there's a chance its internal buffer still has some residual charge. Could use it to spike the signal, fry their sensors, temporary blind. Not long." Abigail nodded slowly. "I'll draw their attention. You move when they shift focus. Fast, precise." He opened his mouth to protest, not liking the idea of her taking the heat, but she was already moving. A blur of gray fur and cold power leaping off the ridge, slamming into one of the drones with a burst of snarling fury. The others shifted focus instantly, swarming toward her, weapon arms deploying from sleek compartments. Rodney didn't waste time. He sprinted down the slope, low and fast, ignoring the ache in his ribs, slipping through wreckage and wires, vaulting over scattered debris. He reached the mech husk in time to see sparks still twitching inside its central chamber. He yanked off a panel and dug into the exposed conduit, rerouting a current through his wrist module and channeling it into a localized EMP burst. There was a pop of ozone and the drones wavered, optics dimming, movement faltering. Abigail struck again, slicing through one midair. The other two collapsed, crashing into the dirt and twitching heaps. Breathing hard, Rodney stepped out, adrenaline still pumping. Abigail stood amid the wreckage, chest heaving, one shoulder torn but her expression calm. She didn't speak, just walked toward him and shoved two claws against his chest. "Useful," she said, then turned to inspect the tower. It felt like the closest thing to a compliment he'd ever get from her. They entered the relays in her access chamber, and Rodney began downloading the databanks. The logs confirmed it. Falsified broadcasts, rerouted orders, manufactured search routes that diverted recon teams from key locations. Someone had been playing Command for fools, or was Command itself the puppeteer? It didn't add up. Abigail watched over his shoulder, silent as always, until the final fragment decrypted. It was a personnel tag his flagged in a transmission as expendable civilian observer. No name, just his ID marked as non-essential, marked to be left behind if contact was lost. He stared at it longer than he meant to. Abigail said nothing, but when he looked up, her expression had shifted. Not sympathy, not pity, but something close to understanding. "I volunteered," he muttered, voice low. "They said we'd be helping recover history, preserving what's left. I didn't sign up to be discarded." Abigail moved to the patch, tail swaying behind her. "Then don't be," she paused. "You're alive. You're learning. That makes you dangerous. Maybe more dangerous than you know." He followed her out and they set off again, moving deeper into the moon's dead zones. Something had shifted, not in the mission in them. She still walked ahead, still barely spoke. But now when she looked back to check if he was still there was something else in her gaze, and he was starting to understand something too, about how loyalty isn't always earned with strength, but with proof. With showing up again and again, even when no one expects you to matter. Maybe especially then. They moved through the crumpled valleys of debris without another word, and Rodney found it strange how silence between them no longer felt like rejection. Abigail didn't offer praise for his quick thinking at the relay tower, but she didn't need to. Her action said enough. She slowed her pace just enough to make sure he kept up. Her head tilted slightly whenever he stopped to scan a wrecked drone for parts. She never interfered, but she watched. And more than that, she listened. It wasn't kindness. It was respect, the real kind. The kind you earned when survival was no longer theoretical, but something that clawed at your heels with metal teeth and scorching plasma. Rodney wasn't under any illusions. He wasn't a warrior, but he had a brain and out here that counted for more than brute force. By midday, the gravity pulses worsened, the instability of the moon's fractured core making every step unpredictable. The terrain pitched like waves beneath their feet, and broken satellites drifted through the thin atmosphere, suspended in slow arcs before smashing into the ground. Rodney kept a tight grip on his tools and scavenged components, his fingers numb from overuse, his body sore from the crash, but he didn't complain. Abigail never looked tired, but there was a sharpness to her breathing that told him even she was feeling the strain. They reached a narrow pass flanked by 2 crumbling antenna towers, metal bones reaching skyward like the ribs of some ancient beast, and just beyond it, something caught Rodney's eye. Not wreckage, movement. A drone larger than the last ones, sleeker, newer. Its black plating shimmered with a corporate insignia he didn't recognize. Not military issue, not government. Something off the books. Its rotors were silent, its movements deliberate. Rodney ducked low behind the remains of a transport pod, motioning to Abigail, who immediately took to the shadows without a sound. They both watched as the drone examined a downed satellite and injected it with a data spike. The terminal blinked green, uploading something, perhaps overriding the logs. Whatever it was doing, it was covering tracks. Rodney's mind raced. This wasn't salvage, this was sabotage. He glanced at Abigail. She pointed toward the pod's undercarriage, her meaning clear. If they moved fast, they could intercept the drone and retrieve its data core before it completed the upload. The risk was enormous. The drone had defense systems. He saw the folded weapon arms on its underside, but something else caught his attention. The satellite it was spiking had a standard civilian port, non-encrypted legacy system, which meant with the right angle and a little improvisation, he could tap into the relay without alerting the drone. Abigail raised an eyebrow as he whispered the plan, skeptical but silent. She didn't argue, just nodded once and moved to take position, blade drawn, body low and coiled like a jungle predator. Rodney moved carefully, crawling through the exposed conduit tunnels beneath the satellite carcass. The cables were frayed, but live. He took out a bent spoon, the one he'd pocketed earlier from the crash site mess kit, and wedged it against a broken prong to redirect the flow. A crude patch, but it gave him just enough current to power his uplink tool. He slid the connector into the civilian port, biting his lip as the screen lit up. He navigated past the false firewall, clearly slapped together by someone in a rush, and dug into the active files. Packet after packet scrolled past, and then, bingo, coordinates, names, a full list of operatives and drone deployment routes. Whoever had set this up was using scavenger drones to erase evidence of earlier missions gone wrong. Missions that involved civilians, contractors, even off-world scientists, disappearances that were never publicly confirmed. As he pulled the data, the drone's rotors whined softly. It had noticed the power flux, its sensors twitched and its weapons deployed scanning with infrared beams. Rodney's pulse spiked. He whispered into the calm now. Abigail struck like lightning. One moment the drone hovered silently, the next she was in the air, launching herself from the shadows with a guttural roar. Her claws tore through the drone's undercarriage just as its beam locked onto Rodney's location. It fired too late. A burst of plasma scorched the ground beside him, but Abigail was already atop it, wrestling its frame to the ground. Sparks flew as she yanked loose a panel and sliced into the processor unit. Rodney scrambled to disconnect the uplink just as the entire structure collapsed inward, the energy core overloading in a muted, flickering pop. The drone convulsed once and went dead. Breathing hard, Rodney staggered out from beneath the satellite, clutching the uplink device. Abigail rose slowly from the wreckage, her fur smoking slightly where a plasma scorch had grazed her side. She winced but didn't acknowledge the pain. He moved toward her, checking her arm, but she brushed his hand away. "I'm not broken," she growled. He backed off, raising both palms. "Didn't say you were, just making sure you're not leaking out the side." That got a breath of amusement from her, short, sharp, and completely unexpected. "You're a strange little human," she muttered, then reached down and picked him up by the front of his jacket, lifting him off the ground effortlessly. "But you've got teeth where it counts." He blinked, startled, dangling for a moment before she set him down again. I didn't do much. You did the hard part. She stepped in closer, her yellow eyes narrow. You found the signal, hacked the drone, pulled the data while staying alive. That's more than half the scouts I've worked with. Then, almost grudgingly, I'm beginning to think soft is the wrong word. Rodney chuckled as he checked the data on his pad. I'll take that as a compliment. His fingers paused over the file labeled Ghost List. He opened it and saw something that made his stomach drop. His name, not just his ID this time, but his full name alongside others marked Priority Silence, which meant they weren't just supposed to be abandoned. They were targets, collateral that needed cleaning. Abigail read over his shoulder and snarled, They want you dead, and they sent you here without telling you. He nodded, slow and grim. Looks like they want both of us dead now. You've been off-grid long enough that your own command profile's marked potentially compromised. She didn't seem surprised. Let them come, she said flatly. We survive, we find truth, then we burn their lies down. Rodney looked at her, really looked. Not just the lean, scarred warrior who called him soft, but the one who didn't hesitate to dive into danger for someone she barely knew, the one who bled without complaint, the one who didn't smile, but didn't walk away either. He nodded, something solid settling in his chest. Then let's give them something to fear, he said. Together. And for the first time, she didn't argue. The flickering glow of a decaying satellite overhead cast warped shadows across the narrow ravine as they pushed forward, silence falling between them again, but not the same silence from before. This one felt shared, comfortable. Abigail didn't glance over her shoulder as often now. Rodney didn't trip on every uneven surface. They moved like they had learned each other's rhythm, him always scanning the horizon for anomalies, her always scanning for threats. The tension hadn't left the moon, but something between them had settled. After the drone incident, they were no longer just two bodies forced into proximity. They had bled, risked, and narrowly survived together. It had changed things, not entirely, but enough. As they made their way across a fractured bridge of compacted debris, the gravity shifted again, this time more violently than before. Rodney grunted as he dropped to one knee, bracing himself with a twisted metal rod. Abigail leapt ahead easily, using the shift to her advantage, her frame nearly floating as the pull flickered off, then slammed back on. Rodney cursed under his breath but didn't ask for help. Instead, he waited for the pulse to pass, then used a nearby support beam to vault across a gap. He stumbled, but landed. When he looked up, Abigail was watching him from the edge. She didn't smile, but her tail flicked twice and she held out her hand, not offering help exactly. More like inclusion. He took it without hesitation, and she pulled him the rest of the way with one effortless motion. They set up a temporary shelter in the hollow of a crushed maintenance rig as plasma storms rumbled in the distance. The air was dry, but the static charge crawled over their skin like an invisible mist. Rodney worked on his uplink, trying to clean the corrupted data they'd extracted from the drone. Abigail sat beside him, sharpening her blade with slow, steady movements. Occasionally, she would glance his way, not like she was judging him, but like she was trying to figure something out. He'd grown used to the silence, the way she observed instead of asked. It was how she'd survived. Still, after another 20 minutes of her tail thumping lightly against the rig's metal hull in a pattern that wasn't quite random, he finally said, "You're thinking loud. Spit it out." She stopped sharpening, flicked her eyes to his face. "Your people," she said slowly. "They treat knowledge like a weapon." He didn't look up from the uplink, because it is. She tilted her head. "And you turn scraps and old wires into things that blind machines. That's not normal." Rodney exhaled, rubbing his eyes. "I grew up in the back corridors of a mining ship. If something broke, no one came to fix it. You learned fast, or you suffocated, or you froze. I don't build pretty things. I build what I need to survive." Abigail stared at him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Useful?" He smirked, high praise from a walking knife rack. Her eyes narrowed, but not with anger. "You talk too much when you're tired." You growl too much when you're relaxed, he shot back, but there was no bite in his tone. The back and forth had become easy now, familiar. He turned his attention back to the uplink, but the display was still full of corrupted sectors and scrambled packets. He sighed, setting it down. I need a cleaner data environment, somewhere insulated, shielded. This junked shell is bleeding signal noise. Abigail shifted. There's a fallback node station northwest. If it's still intact, it will have what you need. You know the layout that well. She didn't answer immediately. Then I used to be assigned to this sector, years ago, before they reassigned my squad to Border Patrol. Rodney's brow furrowed. That why you're so good at navigating the gravity shifts? She didn't meet his eyes. That's why I don't get lost when everything else is broken. They packed up before the next magnetic storm rolled in. The trek to the fallback station was slow, dangerously exposed. Metal cliffs loomed around them like skeletal towers, casting long shadows through fields of ash and rubble. At one point, a section of the ground buckled, exposing an ancient crater lined with hollow drone pods, their empty sockets watching like dead eyes. Rodney shivered not from the cold, but from the creeping awareness that they were being watched, not by machines, by someone, or something that wanted them to keep moving. When they reached the outskirts of the fallback station, the sky pulsed red with the rising storm. The station itself was still standing barely. Its antennae bent, its walls scarred by impact, debris, and time, but the inner core was intact. Rodney's face lit up as he powered the old interface panel, and it hummed back to life with a flicker of green across the screen. "We're in business," he muttered, fingers flying across the terminal. Abigail circled the perimeter, her blade drawn, ears flicking with every gust of wind. She paused occasionally, scanning the horizon, posture tense. Rodney didn't notice her stop entirely until the screen pinged, access granted. "I've got clean link to the decryption protocols," he said. "Give me 15 minutes and I can rebuild the ghost list and figure out who's behind." Quiet Abigail hissed. She pressed him flat against the wall without warning, her body half covering his. At first he thought it was another drone, but then he heard it 2 footsteps, not mechanical, human, several of them marching in staggered patterns around the exterior walls. Rodney looked up at her, whispering, "They tracked us." Abigail's eyes glowed brighter. "No, they were already here, waiting." The lights on the terminal flickered, and Rodney barely had time to rip the uplink module from the port before the wall exploded inward. The blast sent him flying. Abigail shielded his fall with her body, landing hard, but rolling instantly back to her feet. Out of the smoke came armored figures, mercenaries by the look of them. Not military, but definitely trained. One of them shouted something, but Rodney didn't understand the dialect. Abigail did. She answered with a feral snarl and launched herself forward. What followed was chaos. She moved through the attackers like lightning, her blade a blur of steel and claw, but there were too many. Rodney scrambled back to the terminal, using what little power remained to initiate a burn sequence, wiping any remaining logs so nothing could be taken. A stray shot grazed his arm, searing pain through the fabric. He didn't stop. When he turned again, Abigail was bleeding, breathing hard, one knee dipping low, but still standing. The mercenaries circled, cautious now, unsure if they wanted to test her again. Rodney rose to his feet beside her, holding a loose energy coil in one hand like a makeshift weapon. "You're not doing this alone," he said. She gave him a look, half fury, half disbelief. Then she laughed just once, a deep, chesty sound that ended in a sharp breath. "Try not to die, soft one," she growled. And together they faced the fire. The firefight didn't slow. It evolved. What started as a barrage of concussive blasts and wild shouting turned into a brutal game of territory. The fallback station was too small to maneuver, so both sides began circling, flanking, trying to push the other toward weak footing or into the open. Abigail was a blur, claws gleaming, teeth bared, eyes burning with focus. Her blade struck with such precision it almost looked rehearsed. Rodney stayed low, moving between cover. his hands wrapped tight around the scavenged energy coil, which hummed with an unstable core. He didn't know how long it would last if used, but he knew he could trigger a short-range discharge strong enough to knock out cybernetics and overheat powered armor. If he timed it wrong, it would fry both of them, but if he hesitated, they'd both be dead anyway. One of the mercs broke from the side, rifle raised, heading straight for the data port Rodney had just pulled his module from. Rodney ducked and sprinted across a corridor of exposed steel, shoving the barrel of the energy coil into a power socket as he passed. It absorbed just enough to glow white-hot, and when the merc aimed his gun, Rodney hurled the coil like a grenade. It struck the side of the terminal wall, arcing out a pulse of blue light that collapsed the merc in a stuttering fit, smoke pouring from the side of his helmet as he convulsed and dropped. That gave Abigail enough time to take down two others with sweeping, bone-snapping kicks, and a final slash to one's chest plate that knocked him clear through a collapsing doorway. The last two tried to fall back. One radioed for exfil. Abigail heard it. She launched herself off a railing and crashed into him mid-run, both of them vanishing behind a pile of shattered consoles. The last merc raised a flamethrower. Rodney thought only for a second, then reached into his satchel, pulled the drone spike module he'd salvaged earlier, and slammed it into the relay terminal. The system surged, then spat sparks across the room. A flash ignited near the fuel reserves lining the wall. The flamethrower lit up, but not in the way the merc intended. When the fire cleared, the room was in ruins, but the mercenaries were down. Abigail was crouched over the one she'd tackled, breathing hard, first singed at the edges, but her eyes still clear. Rodney leaned against the wall, chest rising and falling with uneven rhythm. He didn't feel victorious. He felt used, hunted, and pissed. He limped toward the man Abigail had pinned, who groaned and spat blood through a cracked visor. Rodney crouched down, tugging the helmet off with both hands. The merc didn't look surprised to see a civilian face. "You're not supposed to be here," the man rasped. Rodney didn't answer. He just stared. "Who sent you?" The merc grinned with broken teeth. "Does it matter? You're on a list. Doesn't matter why. Doesn't matter what you know. The second you touched that signal, your life got deleted." Rodney felt Abigail's claws tap his shoulder once gently. A silent warning. Be done with it. He nodded. They learned what they needed, and any longer here was a death sentence. Abigail stood first. "We move." They escaped through the rear-loading corridor as the magnetic field started to ripple again. The sky boiled above, red and orange tendrils of light spiraling down from the higher atmosphere. Rodney stumbled once, his leg finally failing under him after the shock. Abigail caught him without hesitation, throwing his arm over her shoulders. "You walk or I drag you," she growled, but her tone didn't have its usual sharpness. If anything, it sounded protective. "Not exactly the pep talk I had in mind," he muttered, half grimacing. "Save your complaints. You're still breathing." They traveled in staggered silence until they reached an abandoned cargo vessel half buried under a collapsed canyon wall. The inside had clearly been stripped years ago, but the structure still held. Abigail kicked the door shut, slumped Rodney into a corner, and went back to bolt the entry. She didn't speak for several minutes. She checked for surveillance drones, ran a sweep for tracking signals, then returned. By the time she sat across from him, the adrenaline had long since burned off, and only the raw ache remained. Rodney looked at her, really looked, and for the first time he saw fatigue in her posture, not weakness, just the cost of everything. Her side was scorched from where the plasma had kissed her fur. Her breathing was uneven, and her eyes darted toward every small sound. She wasn't unshakable, she was just too stubborn to fall. "I think I get it now," he said quietly. She raised a brow. "You don't trust anyone, because they've all tried to use you." Abigail didn't respond. Instead, she reached down and pulled a long scarlet thread from a pouch on her belt. It was frayed and covered in faded glyphs. She turned it in her claws slowly. "My squad was promised freedom after the last border mission," she said, voice low. "We were told we'd be rotated out, retired, maybe even given settlement rights." She paused. They sent us on a final recon sweep near the asteroid barrens. Only I came back. They told me the others were lost. I found their ID chips months later, stored in a black box with command tags. Rodney's stomach sank. "You stayed anyway?" he asked. I disappeared, officially marked as missing in action. That's when they stopped looking. She looked up at him until you showed up, and now they're looking again. Rodney stared at her, uncertain of what to say. He wanted to apologize, but he knew she wouldn't care for it, so he did the one thing that felt real. He pulled out the ghost list data again and handed it over. "I decrypted more of it. There's a full trail now. Orders rerouted through a shell company, Lazari Systems. It's fake, the whole command chain. They're using outdated missions to bury failures. Anyone who survives something, they weren't supposed to become a threat. That includes you. That includes me." Abigail studied the data without blinking. "Then we burn it down." He smiled faintly. "That's a plan I can get behind." She leaned forward then, slow and deliberate until they were eye to eye. The glow in her pupils had softened, not dimmed, but tempered. "I don't carry things I don't value," she said, voice low, almost a whisper. "You're not cargo anymore, human. You're mine now, and I protect what's mine." Rodney didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He just met her gaze and nodded once. "Then let's fight like it." And for a moment, inside that broken ship surrounded by a dying world, there was peace. Strange, unexpected, but peace all the same. The next morning, or at least what passed for it on this dying moon, began with silence so thick Rodney thought he had gone deaf. But it wasn't the silence of death. It was the kind that settled after storms, when the wind stopped screaming and everything holds its breath to see what's still standing. The broken cargo vessel had shielded them through the worst of the plasma surge. Its bulkhead remained scorched, half the roof warped from atmospheric friction, but it held. Abigail was already up when Rodney stirred. She was crouched by a vent, claws resting on her knees, listening to the low crackle of the wind outside as if expecting it to speak. Her tail twitched once, sharply, then settled. When she looked over at him, she didn't say anything at first. She just studied his face like she was still trying to map the way he worked. He offered her a nod, still sore from the previous day's fight, and she returned it. Wordlessly, she tossed him a pouch of rehydrated rations and slid her blade into its sheath. The day was starting, and neither of them were in the mood for ceremony. They moved out an hour later, navigating what was left of the canyon. Rodney carried the uplink module in a case strapped across his back, every so often glancing at its signal as it blinked green, indicating a low but stable trace on the falsified command network. They had a lead now, coordinates leading toward the administrative relay station, buried deep in the moon's central plateau. If Lazari Systems had a physical anchor point on this rock, it would be there. Abigail confirmed the location with a single glance at the map, and then simply said, "Too quiet." She didn't elaborate, but Rodney understood. After what they'd survived, quiet meant something was setting up, not gone, just waiting. Terrain changed the deeper they went, less metallic wreckage, more jagged stone. As they passed into the plateau region, gravity normalized for the first time in days. Rodney hadn't realized how disorienting the shifting pull had been until it stopped. His steps felt heavier, more rooted. Abigail didn't seem affected either way. Her frame was made for constant adaptation. Her legs coiled and stretched like springs, every movement calculated and efficient. What changed, though, was her distance from him. She no longer moved far ahead. She stayed close, only a step or two ahead, glancing back at him every so often, not to check if he'd fallen, but because she was measuring things now. Not the threat level, him, as if she were gauging how much of her guard she could afford to lower. Rodney wasn't blind to it. She hadn't been the same since the mercenaries. The way she'd shielded him, the way she'd growled about him being hers, had shaken something loose. He tried not to overthink it at the time, but now that they were alone in the vast emptiness of the plateau, it sat between them like an unspoken promise neither of them knew how to unpack. It wasn't possessiveness. It was protection. loyalty, and maybe something neither of them had felt in years. They reached an abandoned scout station just as the sun dipped behind the fractured skyline. The structure was half sunken into the rock, its beacon long dead, but the inside was dry, intact, and more importantly, shielded from long-range scans. Rodney powered up the internal server using a hand-crank generator and connected his uplink module to begin decrypting the remaining data from Lazari servers. Abigail stood by the narrow slit of a window, arms crossed, ears perked, body coiled as always. She hadn't sat down once. Rodney worked quickly, his fingers gliding over the terminal's crude interface, drawing up layer after layer of falsified mission logs, drone deployment charts, and deep-node communication packets. The further he dug, the more tangled it became. Lazari wasn't just faking orders. They were diverting resources, assigning ghost teams to false locations, using salvaged missions as cover for corporate theft and experimental research distractions. And the bodies left behind, Rodney's team, Abigail's squad, they were just liabilities caught in the gaps. "I found it," he said, his voice low but tight with urgency. "They're operating under the guise of an abandoned command relay 4 kilometers from here. That's the pulse we've been chasing." Abigail didn't move from the window. "How many?" Rodney hesitated. "At least a dozen automated defense units. Maybe 2 human handlers could be more hiding behind the signal dampening. The encryption is tight. They're serious about staying hidden." She turned then, her yellow eyes sharp. "We take it out." Rodney blinked. "We don't even know what's inside. There could be experimental tech, traps. We need a plan." Abigail stepped forward, slow but deliberate. "Plans change, action doesn't." He watched her carefully. "This isn't revenge. It's justice," she said flatly. "For my squad, for the ones on that list, for you." Rodney swallowed. "And what if we don't make it back?" She didn't smile, but she didn't blink either. "Then we die with the truth in our hands." For a long moment, the only sound in the station was the hum of the generator and the soft static of wind against metal. Then Rodney exhaled, nodded once, and turned back to the terminal. He printed the location data onto a portable drive and shut the system down. They left before the second moonrise, navigating by the shifting blue light of the atmosphere's torn edges. As they moved, Abigail slowed again, but not for reconnaissance. She matched his pace on purpose. Her claws brushed against his hand once lightly, a flick of fur and warmth that she didn't acknowledge afterward, but she didn't pull away, neither did he. Hours passed before they reached the perimeter of the relay compound. The structure was nestled in a bowl of rock, camouflaged against scans by a grid of stealth panels and buried signal dampeners. Rodney took one look and knew there was no walking in the front, but the terrain offered alternatives: collapsed vent shafts, half-covered drainage trenches, access lines leading beneath the structure. They took the vent path, crawling through tight passageways barely wide enough for Abigail's frame. At one point, Rodney slipped on a layer of frost and nearly fell into a chasm below, but she grabbed his arm and yanked him back, holding him longer than necessary. Her grip was strong, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet. "You're not allowed to die. Not now." Rodney looked up at her, heart thudding, breath shallow, wasn't planning on it. They crawled the rest of the way in silence, emerging inside a storage chamber filled with flickering monitors and spare drones. As they readied their gear and prepared to infiltrate the heart of the facility, Abigail reached out again, this time not to stop him, not to protect, but to press her forehead briefly against his. "For my kind, that means I trust you," she murmured. Rodney nodded slowly. "Then let's earn it." And together, they stepped into the dark. The interior of the hidden Lazari facility was colder than Rodney expected, not physically, though the recycled air carried a bite, but an atmosphere. Every wall was matte black, broken only by pulsing blue panels that looked like breathing lights, the kind designed to intimidate without being overt. There were no welcoming corridors, no signs, no attempts at pretense. It was the kind of place meant to be forgotten, buried in the rock until someone tripped over it decades too late. Rodney crouched low behind a scaffold of supply crates as he scanned the interior map from a tapped node. Abigail was already 2 steps ahead, slipping like a shadow between motion-activated sensors that hadn't accounted for her speed or size. She didn't ask if he could keep up anymore. She just assumed he would, and somehow he did. Rodney patched into a side console and ran a silent breach protocol using fragments of Lazari's own encryption to mask their signal. What he found chilled him. This wasn't just a black site, it was a hub. A silent relay feeding altered mission data to every corner of the sector, rerouting resources, terminating records, identifying non-compliant assets for erasure. Everything he and Abigail suspected was true, but the scope was worse. Dozens of teams were listed, flagged for abandonment or elimination. Civilians, freelancers, scouts, even diplomats. And one name sat at the top of the log like a signature. Director Halden Verne, former Strategic Intelligence Liaison, presumed dead after a shuttle explosion 4 years ago. The man hadn't died. He'd vanished into this ghost network, pulling strings from behind a wall of smoke and misinformation. Rodney downloaded the files to his uplink as quietly as he could. Abigail motioned him to freeze with a flick of her tail. Footsteps echoed down the far corridor. Not the heavy plod of armored boots, but softer, more deliberate. 2 handlers, male voices, one complaining about a system reboot slowing down the AI uplink, the other grumbling about having to stay through another cycle while corporate handled the outer transmissions. They passed without noticing the pair crouched in the dark. Abigail didn't go for the kill, not yet. She watched them go, memorizing their cadence, their rotation, the way their fingers hovered over their sidearms out of habit. Then she nodded to Rodney. They moved again. The server core was 3 levels down, accessible only through a lift locked behind a biometric scanner. Rodney had no clearance. Abigail had claws. They waited for one of the handlers to return alone, ambushed him in the blind spot behind a pillar. He didn't even have time to shout before Abigail pressed him into the wall, claws at his throat. Rodney scanned his eye, copied his ID chip, and downloaded the lift codes in under 10 seconds. The handler whimpered something about not being paid enough to die in a rock, and Abigail growled low, then stopped working for killers. She let him live. Rodney didn't ask why. Maybe she still had a code buried beneath all the fury. They descended into the lower level and stepped into something that didn't feel like a military base anymore. It felt like a shrine. The walls were smooth, curved like a cathedral vault, etched with alien alloy patterns that pulsed softly, almost rhythmically. Rodney looked up and realized half the architecture had been retrofitted over pre-existing structures. This place had been built to top something old, not human. Lazari had found something alien here and used it to hide their operations beneath the ruins. And if the power signatures were accurate, whatever it was still alive. Abigail, Rodney whispered, gesturing toward the strange alloy. "You feel that?" She nodded once. "It's watching." Rodney pulled up a fresh readout. Deep within the core, below even this level, there was a pulse. Not just electricity, conscious energy. A rudimentary AI interface bonded to whatever alien hardware this was. Lazari had harnessed it to disguise their activity, maybe even to protect it. No wonder no one had discovered the site. It wasn't just shielded, it wanted to be hidden. They reached the central node, a massive column of cables and interface glass humming with data feeds. Rodney approached the access point and pulled out the uplink. "This is it. Once I plug in, their system goes blind for maybe 5 minutes. That's all I've got. After that, every defense protocol is going to light up and will have an effect on us." Abigail stood beside him, shoulders tense, eyes narrowed. "We make it count." Rodney hesitated. "There's something else." He looked at her, uncertain how she'd take it. "I can reroute the pulse, take the AI offline, and send all the ghost data directly to every public channel in the quadrant. But if I do that, the pulse collapses. This whole place will self-destruct, and I don't know what that alien tech will do when it's destabilized." She didn't flinch. "Do it." He studied her face. If we do this, we don't get a second chance. We can't come back and clean up. We're either alive with the truth or dead with a crater behind us. She stepped closer, leaned in until he could feel the low rumble of her breath. I trust you. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Rodney nodded once, heart pounding. He plugged in the uplink. The screen flared, then went dark. The system paused just a second too long. Then it roared to life, alerts spiraling across every panel. The defense grid began to shudder, turrets lifted, alarms wailed. But the data began to stream. Ghost logs, mission alterations, personnel files, classified schematics, everything. Rodney worked with shaking fingers, rerouting power, balancing loads, overloading cores just long enough to keep the flow moving. His mouth was dry, his back soaked in sweat, but he didn't stop. He was all in. The AI pulse began to spike. The alien alloy reacted instantly, glowing brighter than cracking in fine lines like glass under strain. Abigail braced herself between him and the door, claws bared, teeth showing. The first turret dropped from the ceiling. She launched upward, slammed into it with a savage kick, and tore the barrel free before it could fire. Another turret began spinning up. Rodney reached over, pulled a coil from the uplink itself, and channeled the last of its charge into a voltage spike. The circuit fried, the turret died, but now the system knew they were there. The floor began to quake. A sound like grinding stone filled the chamber. Then the uplink pinged, data complete. Rodney looked at Abigail. It's out everything, all of it. The core behind them glowed brighter, too bright. The alien system was no longer passive. It was reacting. The walls started to shift, folding in like a collapsing lung. Abigail grabbed him, hauling him toward the lift shaft. Too slow, he grunted. No, she snarled. Not losing you. They ran, dodging falling debris, heat warping the very air around them. The ground cracked beneath their feet. The lift had already snapped free of its rails, no way out. Abigail stopped, spun, and shoved him toward a ventilation shaft barely wide enough. Go! I'm not leaving you! She roared in his face. You are not dying here! Then the floor split beneath them, and she caught him again, carried him like he weighed nothing, claws scraping walls, muscles straining as she launched them into the shaft with seconds to spare. The moon rumbled as the facility imploded. They didn't stop running until the sky was visible again, and even then she didn't let go. By the time the dust settled behind them, the facility had vanished beneath the moon's crust, replaced by a growing crater of molten slag and black smoke that curled skyward like a funeral pyre. Rodney lay half-conscious on a ledge above the impact zone, lungs burning, throat raw, head pounding from the sudden pressure drop. Abigail crouched beside him, her chest heaving from exertion, fur soaked in sweat and streaked with soot, claws still flexing like she hadn't fully convinced herself the danger had passed. Her arm bled from where a shard of alien alloy had torn through her shoulder, but she hadn't slowed. Not even once. He remembered her roar when the walls caved in, the raw sound of defiance and desperation. He remembered her body coiling around him as they tumbled through the collapsing shaft, claws digging into rock, muscles straining to catch ledges as gravity failed them both. She had carried him through that storm, again. And now, finally, they were still. Rodney sat up slowly, groaning as every joint complained, "Are we alive?" Abigail didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the crater, watching as the last vestiges of the facility's power core sputtered into silence. When she finally turned to him, her expression wasn't victory. It was something heavier, relief maybe, or guilt that they hadn't done more, even though they'd just destroyed the single most dangerous black site on the moon. She exhaled slowly, nostrils flaring, and said, "Barely." Rodney coughed out a laugh, then winced. "Good enough." They found shelter in a fractured observation bunker a few clicks from the blast zone. It had been abandoned for years, probably since the last mining survey went dark. Inside, the air was dry and stale, but breathable. The solar panel array on the roof still worked well enough to power lights and a weak heating coil. Rodney collapsed onto a bench beneath the console array, watching static flicker across a cracked monitor. Abigail didn't sit. She paced at first, prowling the perimeter, double-checking locks, peering through narrow slits in the steel walls. Only when she had circled twice did she stop and sink to one knee beside him, her breathing shallow, her shoulders finally lowering. It was the first time he'd seen her still since the mission began. He looked over, unsure how to break the silence. "That crater out there, I think you saved a few hundred lives. Maybe more." She didn't respond right away. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her blade sheath, the motion absent, distracted. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "They'll send others. Maybe not today, but the truth's out now. The people behind this Vern, Lazari, whoever's still hidden, they'll come." Rodney nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Abigail's eyes met his. There was something different in them now, not just respect or alliance, something more vulnerable, something rarer, trust unguarded. "You kept up," she said. "You didn't fold, even when everything burned." He offered a tired smile. "I figured someone had to keep reminding you that just because I'm soft doesn't mean I break easy." That got a breath of laughter from her, short, sharp, but real. She shook her head slightly, then moved closer, her presence warm, grounding. "I carried you because it was faster," she said, voice quieter now. He arched a brow. "Is that what we're calling it?" Her claws tapped the bench beside him once, also because I wanted to. Rodney blinked. "That I wasn't expecting you to say that." "I wasn't expecting to say it," she admitted, tail curling behind her. "But when I thought you might die in that shaft, something in me snapped. Not fear, something deeper, like I'd lose more than a teammate." Rodney sat up straighter, heart beating just a little faster. "You didn't. I'm here." She leaned in slowly, movements precise but unhurried until their faces were inches apart. Her breath was warm and her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "You're not cargo anymore. You're not dead weight. You're not just someone I protect because the mission says so." He swallowed hard, not from fear but from the overwhelming weight of the moment. "Then what am I?" She pressed her forehead to his just like she had before the mission, only now it lingered. "You're mine," she whispered. And then she kissed him, not rough or dominant like he might have expected from someone so fierce, but careful, deliberate, slow in a way that felt like a declaration. Rodney didn't resist. He leaned in, arms slipping around her waist, pulling her closer. She didn't flinch. She melted. For that moment, the world stopped collapsing. There was no crater, no mercenaries, no false missions or blacklists. Just two survivors who had clawed their way through hell and come out alive together. When the kiss broke, she stayed close. "We'll rest here for a cycle, then we go off-world." Rodney nodded, still breathless. Any idea where? "Somewhere the truth can spread without being killed for it," she replied. "We've got data, we've got names, we just need allies." Rodney smiled. "I've got a few people who owe me favors." She raised a brow. "You favors," he chuckled. "I wasn't always disposable." She leaned against him, finally relaxing. "No, you never were." They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in silence and each other. Not out of necessity, not for protection. But because in the mess of the galaxy, in the ruins of betrayal and scorched ground, they'd found something neither had been looking for, but both had needed. Something real. When they finally slept, it was side by side, not because the cold demanded it, not because fear kept them close, but because there was no longer a need to keep walls between them. And for the first time in a long time, the stars outside the cracked window didn't feel so far away. The static crackle of the relay beacon brought Rodney out of sleep before dawn. The air inside the old bunker was thick with recycled warmth and the faint scent of metal and scorched fur. Abigail lay beside him, one arm draped over his chest, her breathing slow, tail curled across his thigh. She hadn't stirred. Her body finally allowed itself to rest. Rodney didn't move right away. He watched the way her face softened and sleep, the subtle twitches in her ears, the faint sound of her claws relaxing from a defensive curl. The war inside her was quiet for now. It made him realize how much he'd come to need this quiet too, how much of his fear had burned away since meeting her, replaced with something sturdier, something heavier. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was purpose. He slowly slipped from her embrace and moved to the console, still half dead but functional. The faint green light on the data drive blinked again. The transmission had finished bouncing across the sector during the night. The truth was out. Every blacklist, every faked report, every disappearance that Lazari tried to bury. It was now echoing across colonies, outposts, border hubs, and private news feeds. Whistleblower sites were already pinging his backup channels. The director's name was trending across internal comms. There were questions being asked, pressure being applied. Rodney sat back, stunned at how fast it was spreading. They'd actually done it. Abigail rose minutes later, sharp even in waking. She crossed the room silently, crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the console. "Any responses?" she asked, her voice lower than usual, more intimate. He nodded and pointed at the readouts. 3 resistance groups want to coordinate. One of them has a transport near the outer orbit of this moon. Another said they're preparing to formally accuse Lazari of treason through an independent court. Might not stick, but it'll make them bleed in the open. She stared at the screen, claws tapping against her thigh. "It's not enough to wound them. We have to make sure they don't rebuild." Rodney exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, but this is how we start. One infection at a time, and we're not alone anymore." He hesitated, then added, "The transport crew offered to extract us in 16 hours. They're coming in low through the canyon wall, less likely to be picked up by what's left of the orbital sensors. If we're alive by then, we're off this rock." She gave a single nod. "Then we wait." But they both knew it wouldn't be that simple. They spent the next few hours fortifying the bunker. Abigail took point on external traps, using broken satellite cores and scrap wiring to create proximity mines disguised as debris. Rodney installed feedback loops on the entry beacons, so any scans would show the station as non-functional and abandoned. They moved in sync, hardly needing words. There was a rhythm to them now, a kind of quiet trust built from blood, breath, and time spent too close to the edge. He didn't flinch when she brushed past him. She didn't growl when he adjusted one of her traps. It was like being partners had become natural, inevitable. By midday, the first sign of movement appeared on the long-range scanner. A ship Lazari's make. Small, fast, not enough firepower to be a gunship, but too armed to be a simple scout. Rodney watched the dots approach with grim resolve. "Recon team," he muttered. "They must have picked up the signal trail too late to stop the leak. Now they're just trying to clean up whatever's left." Abigail bared her teeth. "Us." Rodney didn't argue. "If they land, we won't have a clean shot at the extraction point. They'll track the incoming ship, then we make them stop looking." She grabbed her blade, then paused. "I go first, draw their fire, you flank from the relay trench." He stepped in front of her before she could move. "No." Her eyes narrowed. "What?" "You don't go alone anymore." His voice was steady. "We fight together." Something flickered in her expression. Annoyance, pride, maybe even a bit of affection. "You finally grew claws, soft one." He shrugged. "I just got tired of watching you take all the hits." They moved out minutes later, side by side across the jagged slope that led toward the canyon rim. Dust rose in spirals from the approaching ship, its thrusters kicking up static that scrambled half their readings. Rodney crouched behind a ridge, pulling out a modified drone signaler. He overclocked its surge core, then set it to trigger on pulse sync. Abigail, meanwhile, slid into the shadows along the left flank, her body hugging the stone, her fur blending with the ash and debris. The ship touched down, its ramp descending with a hiss. 3 soldiers emerged, same armor as before, same precision, but this time Abigail didn't wait. She moved like a storm fast, silent, lethal. Her first strike took the lead soldier's legs out from under him. Rodney detonated the signaler on the right, sending a burst of static through the comms of the second. He dropped his rifle, clutching at his ears. The third raised a plasma sidearm, but Rodney fired a bolt from his salvaged energy rig and clipped the man's leg. Abigail landed the killing blow. It was over in under 20 seconds. They checked the ship. Clean, a small cockpit, encrypted logs, but Rodney dumped the entire nav core into his drive. "We'll use this to trace their fallback coordinates later," he said, panting. "Find out if they have more nests out there." Abigail examined the bodies, checking for trackers. "We have to move. They'll notice this patrol's gone dark. They'll send another." They made it back to the bunker before the next scan sweep passed overhead. The skis remained quiet after, but neither of them believed it would last. Abigail sat beside the door, cleaning her blade. Rodney sat across from her, watching the relay timer tick down the minutes until extraction. He could feel the weight in the air, anticipation, fear, relief, all twisted together. "You're different now," she said suddenly. Rodney looked up. "How so?" "You don't hesitate. You don't ask to be saved. You fight like you want to live." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I didn't before. Not really. But then I met someone who saw something in me, even when I didn't." She blinked slowly. "You saw me, too." They didn't need to say more. When the timer reached 0 and the extraction beacon flared to life in the sky, neither of them ran to it. They walked, steady and unafraid, shoulder to shoulder, bloodied but breathing. And this time, they were leaving together. The extraction ship crested the shattered ridge with a low, almost reverent hum, its black silhouette cutting across the ash-gray sky like a promise finally kept. It slowed as it neared the landing zone, attitude thrusters flaring briefly before setting down with a controlled thud. Rodney stood at the edge of the rise beside Abigail, both of them framed in the dry wind and pale glow of the setting twin suns. He didn't speak, neither did she. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said between them had been spoken already through bruised hands, tight grips, fire-dodged steps, and the shared pulse of survival. Words were slower than what they had now. The rear hatch of the ship hissed open, revealing a single silhouette descending the ramp. A woman with a scar across her cheek and a long coat marked with the insignia of the Free Systems Accord, the group that had promised them passage, asylum, and more importantly, an audience with those who would listen. She greeted them with a nod, no surprise in her eyes, only a measured recognition. "Rodney Kess, Abigail Tell," she said, voice steady even over the wind. "We've read everything you sent. It's already moving." People are angry, some want blood, some want trials, but no one's ignoring it. Rodney stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "You believe it?" She tilted her head. "I believed it before you ever sent it, but now the rest of the quadrant does too." Abigail remained silent, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade, eyes scanning the horizon one last time like she expected one more threat to lurch from the earth. When none came, she stepped forward and matched Rodney's pace. The two of them walked side by side into the ship's hold, not rushed, not dragged, just done. The kind of done that only comes after you've left every part of yourself on the battlefield and still walked away whole. Inside the ship was sparse but functional, military-grade benches, restraint bars, gear lockers along the wall. Rodney set down the data drive on a nearby console. The woman Captain Ilari secured it without comment, then turned and offered them something that looked suspiciously like respect. "You'll have full access to communications during transit. We'll be docking with a neutral carrier hub in 20 hours. After that, your choice. Disappear or stand up in front of the people who want answers. Rodney looked at Abigail. She looked back. They didn't argue, she gave a short nod. We stand. Ilari's smile was tight but genuine. Then rest while you can. They sat alone in the rear of the ship as the engines hummed to life, lifting them away from the moon's fractured skin. Rodney leaned back against the bulkhead, the vibration of escape bleeding into his spine. For the first time in days, he let his shoulders slump. Abigail sat beside him, knees bent, tail curled around the bench's edge. Her fur was cleaner now, scrubbed by time and filtered air, but her posture remained sharp, eyes still calculating even in peace. And yet she leaned toward him, her shoulder brushing his. She didn't pull away. Rodney turned his head slightly. I meant what I said back there. We did it. It's over. Abigail's voice was quiet. It's not over, but it's the end of the part where we were alone. He nodded slowly. That's enough for me. She finally looked at him, eyes soft in a way they hadn't been before. You changed everything. He shook his head. No, we did. She leaned in, pressing her forehead to his, not like before where it was a gesture of trust. This time it was something fuller, warmer. She kissed him again, but slower this time, less rushed by urgency, more steady and complete. When she pulled back, she murmured, You're not a liability. You never were. You were just waiting for a reason to fight. And you were the one who gave me that reason, he replied, resting his hand against hers. You gave me everything, and you didn't even know it. They sat back like that, forehead to forehead, for a long time as the ship continued climbing, stars growing clearer through the reinforced viewport. Abigail eventually shifted to lie beside him, tail draped over his legs like it belonged there. Rodney wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer, and for once she didn't resist the softness of the contact. She welcomed it. Later, when the stars finally bled into the black velvet of deep space and the moon shrank behind them, neither of them looked back. The past had burned, the ghosts had been named, the lies had been broken apart and broadcast to the void. There would be consequences, investigations, retribution, but those belonged to others now. Rodney and Abigail had done what no one else could, and they had found each other in the process, not in the way of fairy tales, but through grit and fury and bone-deep loyalty. They slept curled together in the dark of the transport bay, wrapped in the quiet warmth of earned peace, not fleeing, not hiding, but heading into a future they had created with blood and teeth and unwavering resolve. And when they finally dreamed, they did so without fear.